All right, Noah Echols here from the Center for Sustainable Journalism with Andy Carvin from NPR.
Hey.
Andy, I don't know your official title, so you can tell me a little bit about that. What do you do? And
my official title is Senior Strategist, which is an odd title. I think intentionally odd because it gives me the flexibility to do other things and not have people notice, I suppose. No, it's basically the idea behind the title is, as the name would suggest, I focus on helping build NPR's social media strategy, but more broadly, NPR's public engagement strategy, so offline as well as online.
So I think you're probably most known, at least right now, for what you're doing on Twitter.
Mm-hmm.
So why don't you just give us an update? What are you doing on Twitter? Yeah.
Well, I've been on Twitter for a long time, as well as many other social media platforms, and have done experiments with them to do news gathering. So, for example, in 2008, we worked with people on Twitter to fact-check presidential debates and other ones like that. Starting this past December, though, I started retweeting and talking to people about the Tunisian protests, which ultimately became a full-blown revolution. And I had some good contacts in Tunisia, so I learned about it fairly early, and I think that drew other Tunisians and people from the region to start following me. And as other revolutions popped up in other countries, I found myself doing less of my real day job and more of this, to the point where I'm doing this almost full time now, 7 days a week, sometimes as much as 16, 17, 18 hours a day, trying to use Twitter as a distributed news gathering operation.
So then why Tunisia and why Twitter?
Tunisia is easy to answer. It's because I spent some time there about 6 years ago. In my previous job before coming to NPR, I ran a nonprofit social network called the Digital Divide Network, and there were some events in Tunisia that the UN hosted that gave me reasons to go there on a couple occasions, and I got to know local bloggers, got to know the country somewhat, and kept in touch with them through their blogs first and then later through Twitter. And so when they started talking about these protests in late December, it caught my attention, because with what I knew about Tunisia, any type of protest was unheard of prior to that. And so in some ways it was just happenstance that I happened to be following. As far as Twitter goes, I think it's not like I'm a one platform kind of guy. I'm active on Facebook, I use YouTube, Flickr, and all these others. For this type of work, Twitter's been the most useful for me, simply because it's an ongoing conversation that other people can follow. Whereas like on Facebook, you can have amazing ongoing conversations, but they're often in the form of groups, isolated pockets of people talking among themselves. And with Twitter, it's easier to expand beyond that. And the type of work I'm trying to do at this particular moment is trying to basically throw out a very wide net of potential sources and people who can help me. And for that type of work, at least for now, Twitter is better at it. So, there'll be other projects that are better on Facebook or YouTube or whatever, but this one seems to be working out on Twitter.
So a lot of people are finding a lot of value in what you're doing on Twitter, and you were able to raise a pretty good chunk of change by sending a tweet. Got a lot of attention, and you were able to raise money for some local stations. So do you see that as a model that might be replicated for smaller organizations as a means of financially sustaining themselves?
I think it's worth experimenting with it. I'm not convinced it's a model per se. What happened is in early January, early February, people were asking me if they could send me money to just help me out on this, or to donate to a favorite charity, and neither of those options is acceptable under our NPR ethics rules. And so I tell them privately, look, if you really want to give some money and make yourself feel good about it, give to your local station. I'm sure they'd be thrilled. And I did that privately through email for a while, but I had enough people asking me about where to donate money, I finally just said on Twitter, for those of you who feel strongly about this, donate to your local station, and send out a tweet with the hashtag #GaveForAndy, and with some information about your donation. And that very first day, probably $3,000 or $4,000 got raised for over 3 dozen stations. So probably close to $10,000 overall over the course of several weeks. So it was an interesting experiment on how just one individual working within public broadcasting can do it. Would it work if all of us were doing it? I'm not so sure, because that would really saturate people on Twitter with a lot of donation requests. And so somehow you can get the right balance.
Well, it's certainly a testament to the value that people find in what you're doing, so I think it's good there.
Yeah.
One final question. Where do you see yourself going from here? Is there a continued focus on the Middle East? Will it stay on Twitter? What's in the future for Andy Carvin?
I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing for the time being because it seems to be working out okay. There are still many stories to tell. We don't know what's going to happen with Gaddafi or what's going to happen in Syria, and I'd like to at least reach a point where we have a bit more definitiveness on where it's going to go. Now, granted, these stories are going to take years, if not decades, to play out, but I can't do this forever. But I want to do it long enough so I can feel like there's a sense of closure in some ways.
Sure.
After that, I don't know. I'm hoping we're going to spend some time experimenting with this model in other news contexts. We'll have to figure that out. We're going to have to deal with some scale questions, like what happens if one of us doing it suddenly has 500,000 followers? Is that going to change our ability to do it? If 10,000 people a day are replying you, that could be difficult. So, so we need to figure that all out.
We'll definitely be following. I appreciate your time, Andy.
Thanks. Good talking to you.
Thanks.